Since the invasion of Ukraine began in February, India has stayed remarkably neutral. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has, for the most part, refrained from criticising Putin's war, and India has refused to join in with Western-led sanctions, instead taking the opportunity to buy copious amounts of Russian oil on the cheap. However, in the past couple of weeks, the tide seems to be turning. In mid-September, Modi publicly told Putin that now is not the time for war. And on Tuesday, he held his first call with Zelensky since March. Putin's recent decision, along with the rest of OPEC Plus, to cut global oil production won't have gone down well in Delhi either, given that India is a net oil importer. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at India's stance on Ukraine, whether it's changed in recent weeks, and how it might change in the future. If you like our videos, then be sure to subscribe. Currently, 63% of you haven't made the jump, so we'd really appreciate your support. So, before we get into the most recent development, a quick recap on India's position on the war in Ukraine. In the first few months of the war, some Western commentators and politicians have accused India of being essentially pro-Russia. Now, to be fair to them, there's some evidence for this. As we just mentioned, India has been conspicuously reluctant to criticise Putin, and Russian diplomats have enjoyed preferential treatment in New Delhi. On April the 1st, Narendra Modi, India's Prime Minister, granted an audience to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that he had pointedly denied to any other foreign ministers, including China's Wang Yi. India has also refused to partake in Western sanctions, instead taking the opportunity to buy a whole load of discounted Russian oil, coal and fertiliser. Before the war, Russian oil accounted for less than 1% of all of India's crude imports. Today, that figure has risen to about 20%. Nonetheless, this probably isn't a fair characterisation of India's position, which isn't so much pro-Russia as just not anti-Russia. Modi's preferential treatment of Lavrov can be explained by the fact that India has positioned itself as a possible mediator in any peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and India's oil purchases can be explained by simple self-interest. As a net oil importer in a climate of high energy prices, India needs cheap oil wherever it can get it. This is consistent with India's long-standing policy of neutrality, and it's also motivated by the fact that India and Russia have a historical affinity. The two countries are currently negotiating a free trade agreement, and Russia has traditionally been India's largest supplier of military tech. Between 70 and 80% of India's military equipment are of Russian origin, and even if India is less reliant on Russian and Soviet tech than it once was, Russia remains a key supplier of new weapons and a vital source of maintenance and spares. However, there's some evidence that the relationship has soured over the past few weeks. As we mentioned in the introduction, on Tuesday, Modi called Zelensky for the first time since March, offering to help with any future peace negotiations. Perhaps most significantly, at the annual summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in mid-September, Modi told Putin that, quote, "Today's era is not an era of war." Modi's comments were widely reported in much of the Western media as proof that India had finally shunned Russia over Ukraine. However, this might be an overly optimistic interpretation of Modi's comments. This doesn't necessarily represent a change in policy. India's stated position on Ukraine has always been that the issue should be resolved peacefully, and the issue was actually first raised by Putin during their conversation. This was also the gist of Modi's phone call with Zelensky on Tuesday, where he offered to mediate any peace negotiations. Similarly, it's worth noting that India abstained on the recent UN vote condemning Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territories via sham referendums, which would be consistent with India's previous practice of abstaining on basically all Ukraine-related UN votes. You get the idea. While Modi's comments might represent a shift in tone, in terms of substance it doesn't look like India's position has changed all that much, and they're still pursuing a doggedly neutral policy when it comes to Ukraine. This is, in some sense, unsurprising. At a time when commodity prices are rising across the globe, neutrality allows India to continue buying discounted Russian oil, coal and fertiliser, and it plays well with Modi's domestic base, who generally have a pretty favourable view of Russia and like to see India standing up to the West. Modi's BJP have adopted a sort of India-first Hindu nationalism, and resisting the West's coercive diplomacy while poking fun at the West's apparent hypocrisy makes India look like an independent superpower, which delights the BJP base. Nonetheless, a shift in tone is still significant, and it's a symptom of the fact that, as things stand, Russia-India relations look likely to go downhill in the future. There are a couple of reasons for this. For starters, India is anxious about Russia's accelerating nuclear brinksmanship, especially given that a weakening of the nuclear taboo will increase the chance of a nuclear conflict between Pakistan and India. Putin's inability to achieve a quick victory has also left Modi and the BJP open to Western criticism for an uncomfortably long time. On top of that, Russia's poor military performance in Ukraine and its lack of domestic manufacturing capacity, demonstrated by the fact that it started buying North Korean artillery and Iranian Shahed drones, means that Russia no longer looks as reliable a security partner for India as it once did. Washington apparently sees an opportunity here, which is why the US is reportedly preparing a $500 million arms package for India. But perhaps most of all, India-Russia relations are being strained by Russia's increasing reliance on China. For those of you who don't know, India and China really don't get on. They have an ongoing border dispute over Aksai Chin, and India objects to China's close relationship with Pakistan. India has long seen Russia as both a military counterweight against China's ballooning military budget and a political counterweight against China's increasing influence in Central Asia, which India considers a region of strategic importance. The longer the war goes on and the worse things get for Putin, the more reliant Russia becomes on China. If this trend continues, India-Russia relations are likely to deteriorate as Delhi becomes increasingly wary of China's growing influence. The long and short of it, therefore, is that while India's position on Ukraine hasn't changed all that much recently, in the medium to long term there are reasons to expect India's relationship with Russia to deteriorate. We'll update you on that in future videos, so be sure to subscribe for more updates on global issues like this. Thanks for your support. But that's not all that's happening around the world. In fact, this weekend there was a major election in Brazil, as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria and Latvia. We don't have time to cover them all in separate videos, but we did put together an election special over on the Daily Briefing. So if you want to catch up on what happened, then the link to that is in the description. You should subscribe to that channel too, because while we don't always do election specials every day, we do update you on the biggest news stories and ensure you never miss anything from around the world. Or listen through your favourite podcast app and never feel left behind by the news cycle again.